50,000 men are eating breakfast in the middle of the Sahara, and none of them know it is the last meal they will ever finish. The fires are still low. Bread is passed hand to hand. Somewhere in the column, a soldier checks the leather strap on his sandal for the 100th time, because there is nothing else to do out here except walk and eat and wait for water that arrives less and less often. They left the city of Thebes 7 days ago. Ahead of them is an oasis, a temple, and an old man who insulted their king. Then the horizon changes color, not dark, not stormy in any way these men would recognize. It turns a deep, dirty yellow, low and wide, like the desert itself is standing up. By the time anyone understands what they are looking at, it is already too late to run. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, writing decades after the fact, a wind rose out of the south, violent, deadly, carrying with it columns of sand so vast they buried the entire army where it stood. 50,000 soldiers, he wrote, were entirely covered by the sand and simply disappeared. No cries carried back to Thebes, no wreckage, no survivors stumbling home with a story to tell. One army erased from the face of the earth in a single afternoon. For 2,500 years that has been the official version. A natural disaster. An act of weather, nobody's fault. But here is the detail nobody likes to sit with. Sand does not do this. A storm can bury a man. It cannot make 50,000 swords, 50,000 shields, and 50,000 human skeletons vanish so completely that not one scrap has ever turned up in the right place in 2.5 millennia of searching. Deserts do not swallow armies. Deserts preserve them. Bronze survives. Bone survives. Something else happened to these men, and for most of history, almost nobody thought to ask what. This is the story of an empire, a furious king, a temple that refused to bow, and a disappearance so complete that historians are only now starting to understand it was never a disappearance at all. It was a cover-up, and the man who staged it did not even need magic. He just needed silence and 75 years and nobody left alive to argue. To understand why 50,000 men were walking through the Sahara in the first place, you have to go back 5 years, to a battlefield on the eastern edge of Egypt. Cambyses II was not born to be gentle. He was the son of Cyrus the Great, the man who had built the largest empire the world had ever seen out of nothing but ambition and a very good army. Cyrus conquered nations the way other men collected debts. When he died, that empire and that appetite passed to his son. In 525 BC, Cambyses turned his army toward Egypt. The Egyptian pharaoh, a young man named Psamtik III, had inherited his own throne only months earlier, and he inherited it into a losing war. At a town called Pelusium, on the marshy edge of the Nile Delta, the two armies met. Cambyses used what he knew of Egyptian religion against them. His men marched forward with images of sacred animals painted on their shields, and the Egyptians, unwilling to risk harming what they worshipped, hesitated at exactly the wrong moment. The battle broke. Psamtik fled to Memphis. Memphis fell soon after. Just like that, an empire that had stood for centuries belonged to a Persian king who had never set foot in it before that year. Here's what most people miss about conquest, though. Winning a country is the easy part. Keeping the priests obedient, the temples cooperative, the old gods pointed in your direction, that is the part that breaks kings. Cambyses ruled Egypt as pharaoh for 3 years, and by every surviving account, something in him started to come apart. Picture him inside the great temple at Memphis, surrounded by priests who bow to him in public and despise him in private, in a country whose gods he does not understand and whose language he needs translators to follow. Herodotus, who admittedly loved a good story about a mad king, describes a man tightening his grip on a country that had never wanted him in the first place. The record here is thin, and historians still don't fully agree on how much of the mad Cambyses' reputation was true and how much was Greek storytelling. But one fact is not in dispute. Somewhere in Egypt, a religious institution refused to legitimize him, and Cambyses did not forgive that kind of insult. The institution was the Oracle of Amun, hidden deep in the western desert at an oasis called Siwa. For centuries, kings and travelers alike had crossed hundreds of miles of open sand just to ask the oracle questions about their fate. Alexander the Great would make the same pilgrimage 200 years later. The oracle's word carried weight across the ancient world, and its priests had just told the new king of Egypt that he was not who he claimed to be. Cambyses' answer was simple, and it was total. He would send an army into the desert, not to consult the oracle, to burn it to the ground. 50,000 men were pulled together at Thebes, modern-day Luxor, and given their orders. March west, find the temple at Siwa and erase it, along with anyone who tried to stop them. At the exact same time, in a decision that says everything about where Cambyses' judgment had gone, he personally led a second army south into Nubia, chasing a kingdom the Greeks called Ethiopia. He set out with barely any food for the journey, a catastrophic oversight for any commander, let alone one leading tens of thousands of men into hostile, unfamiliar territory. One king, two deserts, two armies marching toward disasters he could not see coming. If you're the kind of person who likes stories where ancient mistakes come back around to bite the people who made them, you are going to want to see where this goes. Hit subscribe, because we're about to walk into that desert with them, and what waits out there is stranger than a sandstorm. Because here's the thing about the version of this story most people have heard. It's not wrong because it's boring. It's wrong because it's too clean. Herodotus never claimed to have seen what happened. He was writing decades later, piecing the story together from people who had heard it, from people who had heard it from someone else. But the account he left behind is so vivid that it has survived 2,500 years almost unchanged. According to the desert people who told the story, the Persians were crossing the sand roughly halfway between their starting point and the oasis when a great and violent south wind rose up, bringing with it walls of sand so dense that the army disappeared from sight entirely. One moment, 50,000 men mid-march. The next, nothing. It is, without question, one of the most complete disappearances ever recorded in ancient history. And for centuries, almost everyone who studied it took Herodotus at his word, because what other explanation was there? Deserts kill people, storms kill people. Sometimes the math is that simple, except the math has never actually added up. 50,000 men do not travel light. Each of them carried a sword, or a spear, or a bow. Many wore bronze or leather armor. They had helmets, water skins, cooking pots, pack animals loaded down with supplies, the whole column smelling of sweat and dust and animal hide long before the wind ever picked up. All of it, every blade, every buckle, every human skeleton, should still be somewhere under that sand. Bronze does not evaporate. Bone does not evaporate. A storm can bury a man for a season, maybe a decade, until the wind that buried him eventually uncovers him again. The Sahara has been rearranging its dunes for thousands of years since. At some point, something should have surfaced, and people have been looking for over a century. While all of this was unfolding in the western desert, Cambyses' own expedition into Nubia was falling apart in almost the same way, just slower and with witnesses. Before his army had covered even a fifth of the distance, the food ran out. The men started eating the pack animals. Then, when the pack animals were gone, they ate grass and roots, whatever the earth still gave them. And when they reached bare sand, with nothing left to eat at all, groups of 10 soldiers cast lots. The loser was killed and eaten by the other 9. Herodotus records it almost flatly, as though he can barely believe he has to write it down. Only when Cambyses heard what his own men had been reduced to did he finally call off the campaign and turn back toward Thebes, having lost a staggering portion of the force he marched south with. 2 invasions, 2 catastrophes, and only one of them left behind a body count anyone could actually confirm. In the 1930s, the explorer Laszlo Almazy searched the western desert for traces of the missing 50,000 and found nothing. In the summer of 2000, a geological team from Helwan University, out prospecting for oil, stumbled across fragments of ancient textile and pieces of corroded metal that some believed might finally be the army's remains, though nothing was ever confirmed. Then in 2009, 2 Italian archaeologists, twin brothers named Angelo and Alfredo Castiglioni, announced they had found bronze arrowheads, a silver bracelet, and fields of sun-bleached human bone near the oasis of Siwa. They argued the army had taken an unexpected route through the desert, and that pottery found along dried-up wells could be dated to roughly the same era as Cambyses' reign. It made headlines around the world. Finally, people said, the lost army found. Except it wasn't, not really. Egyptian antiquities officials quickly pushed back, pointing out that the brothers had never been granted a permit to excavate in the country, and that their claims had been presented in a documentary rather than through any recognized scientific process. The bones were real. Their connection to Cambyses' army was, at best, unproven. Here's the part that should have bothered everyone from the start. Every discovery of this army, every single one, going back over 100 years, has produced scattered fragments. A few bones here, a bracelet there, never a mass grave. Never the tangled wreckage of an entire military force caught in one place at one moment, the way you'd expect if 50,000 men had genuinely been buried together in a single afternoon. A sandstorm that kills everyone in one location leaves one location full of bodies. What historians and archaeologists were actually finding, spread out across dozens of miles of desert over more than a century, looked like something else entirely. It looked like men who had died apart, in different places, possibly on different days. That is not what a sandstorm does. That is what happens to an army that is running. In 2014, an Egyptologist named Olaf Kaper, working at Leiden University in the Netherlands, was studying carved stone blocks at a site called Amheda, deep in Egypt's Dakhla Oasis. The blocks were old, badly weathered, and had been sitting in storage for years. Kaper's job was simply to decipher the titles carved into them, the kind of tedious, unglamorous work that rarely makes headlines. What he found changed the entire story. The inscriptions belonged to a man named Petubastis III, an Egyptian rebel leader who, according to the stone, had crowned himself pharaoh, not centuries before Cambyses, not centuries after, right around the same window of time. Kaper's conclusion was that the Persian army sent to destroy the Oracle of Amun never actually reached its target. Its real destination, he argued, was the Dakhla Oasis, where Petubastis commanded a rebel force, and it was there that the Persians were ambushed, not scattered by wind, not buried in a single afternoon of bad weather, hunted down and defeated by an enemy who knew the desert far better than they did. Stay with that for a second. Picture what that would actually have looked like, not a wall of sand rolling over a helpless column, but small, fast bands of Egyptian fighters who had grown up in that terrain, striking exhausted Persian units strung out along miles of open ground, cutting off water sources one by one, picking the army apart in pieces over days rather than swallowing it whole in an afternoon. That would explain the scattered bones. That would explain a century of searchers finding fragments instead of a single battlefield. My research shows that the army was not simply passing through the desert, Kaper explained. Its final destination was the Dakhla Oasis. This was the location of the troops of the Egyptian rebel leader, Petubastis III. From that base, Petubastis pushed outward, reclaiming territory, and was eventually crowned pharaoh himself in Memphis, the same city Cambyses had conquered only years before. So why did nobody know this for 25 centuries? Because Kaper believes the true story was buried, deliberately by the next king in line, Darius I, who crushed the Egyptian rebellion 2 years after Cambyses' defeat, and had every reason to keep the earlier disaster quiet. A Persian king does not want the empire's subjects, freshly conquered, still resentful, still capable of revolt, hearing that 50,000 of the emperor's soldiers had been wiped out by a local uprising. That story doesn't just embarrass a dead king. It hands every occupied territory in the empire a blueprint for rebellion. A sandstorm, on the other hand, insults nobody. It doesn't inspire copycats. It doesn't make Persian soldiers wonder if Egyptian rebels can be beaten. It's just weather, bad luck. The kind of disaster no general could have prevented and no enemy gets credit for. This is not a story about a king who lost an army. This is not a story about a rebellion that succeeded against impossible odds. This is a story about how easy it has always been to replace an inconvenient truth with a convenient act of God, and how long that replacement can survive once nobody is left who remembers otherwise. By the time Herodotus arrived in Egypt to gather stories for his histories, the defeat was 75 years old. The soldiers who might have known better were dead. The priests who might have corrected him had their own reasons to stay quiet about a Persian massacre on Egyptian soil. All that was left was the official version, passed down by whoever had survived to keep talking. The wind took the blame. The wind has no descendants to defend and no throne to protect, and that is the real reason nobody ever found the wreckage of 50,000 men in one place. There was no single place. There was a battlefield, spread across miles of hostile terrain where a Persian army was cut down piece by men defending their own oasis, and then there was 2,500 years of silence, carefully maintained by an empire that could not afford to admit the truth. The desert didn't swallow that army, an empire did. So what do you actually take from a story like this? First, the truth. Herodotus wasn't lying when he wrote about the sandstorm. He was almost certainly repeating exactly what he'd been told, in good faith, by people who had themselves been told a story engineered to protect a dead king's reputation. The lesson isn't that ancient historians can't be trusted. It's that even honest storytellers can become the final step in someone else's cover-up. Second, think about how often this still happens. Governments losing wars call it a strategic withdrawal. Companies losing money call it restructuring. Somebody, somewhere right now, is turning a defeat into weather. The instinct that buried this story in the desert 2,500 years ago is not an ancient instinct. It's a human one, and it hasn't gone anywhere. And third, the one that should actually stay with you. 50,000 men went into that desert with names, families, and lives nobody remembers today, not because a storm took that from them, but because an empire decided their deaths were more useful as a myth than as a memory. They didn't just lose their lives out there. They lost the true story of how they died, and it took 2,500 years and one Dutch historian reading the right stone blocks for anyone to even start giving it back to them. That's the real disappearance, not the bodies, the story. Which one of these two versions do you believe, the storm or the ambush? Tell me below, because historians still argue about it, and honestly, so do I. Because in the end, the sand was never the enemy. The silence was.